The purpose of my readings of the textbooks is to reinforce what the teens, our children, are learning in school. I'll read the check on knowledge questions so that way you have an idea of the information to be on the lookout for. Number 1, define imperialism. 2, how could European nations dominate a resource market? What effect did this have on their rivals? 3, what started the Opium War? 4, explain the results of the Treaty of Nanjing. 5, traders in an area of extraterritoriality would be likely to A, follow the laws established by the Chinese government, B, ignore Chinese law and establish their own set of laws, C, live according to no law whatsoever. 6, what city saw the start of the Taiping Rebellion of 1850? A, Beijing, B, Nanjing, C, Nagasaki, and D, Hong Kong. 7, what was the East India Company? Be on the listen for those answers. Why Europeans sought colonies and territories. European explorers sought gold, glory, and God in their first voyages across the sea to the east and to the Americas. In the era of imperialism, which began in the early 19th century, European nations sought to conquer and claim foreign lands. These lands were seen as resources for raw materials that European countries needed to industrialize. It was a time of great competition. If one country claimed land for a certain resource, like sugarcane or rubber, it could dominate the market and make all the profit. If it could find new markets in other lands to buy its own goods, the country would be even more powerful. And sugar, make a note, sugar became known as white gold. Continue reading. If a European country was overpopulated, it could just ship off some citizens to colonies in Asia or Africa or wherever the colonies were. Europeans were convinced that if they wanted to profit and be competitive in growing, imperialism was the way to go. Let me read that again. Europeans were convinced that if they wanted to profit and be competitive in a growing world, imperialism was the way to go. Many countries fell to imperial rule in the 19th and part of the 20th centuries, often at the expense of people indigenous to the land. Just as the Mayans, Incas, Aztecs, and other Native Americans suffered at the hands of foreign rulers, imperialism was destructive to many cultures. Continue reading. Britain establishes trade with India. In 1600, the British set up a monopoly on trade with India by establishing and expanding the East India Company. The opium that was sent to China was grown in India by the East India Company. The British bought spices, tea, cotton, and more from India in exchange for silver for roughly 200 years. The French and Dutch also traded with India, but eventually control fell completely to Britain and the East India Company. Missionary. Side note about missionary: someone who goes on a mission to a foreign place to spread his religion. Okay. Side note: meanwhile, in the U.S., missionaries traveled west of the Mississippi River along the Oregon Trail. Their reports of the beautiful land of the West encouraged others to follow. They believed that American expansion to the Pacific was part of manifest destiny. The idea that the U.S. was chosen by God to spread across the continent and that expansion of the U.S. was the people's manifest or obvious destiny. I'll continue reading. The Opium War and its aftermath. In the beginning, China wasn't so big on foreigners and was strict about whom and what to let into the country. By the 1840s, Britain had established a trade route with China, exporting opium, which is an addictive and dangerous drug that was grown in India in exchange for tea. Tea is less addictive except for the caffeine. The Chinese government knew the huge dangers of opium and had made it illegal to import. Chinese government official Lin Zexu, that is spelled Zexu, pardon me if I mispronounce the name, wrote an open letter to Queen Victoria of England, requesting that she stop the illegal trading. But the letter was ignored, and England's shipments of opium kept hitting China's shores. The Chinese were furious, and in 1839 they dumped about 20,000 chests of the drug into the sea, beginning the Opium War, which lasted from 1839 to 1842. The Chinese blockaded the Canton, present-day Guangzhou, which is a trading area, and forced traders to surrender their opium. The British responded with equal fury and powerful warships, destroying Chinese coastal and river forts and defeating the Chinese. In the 1842 Treaty of Nanjing, China was held responsible for the cost of the war and was forced to open 5 coastal ports, including Hong Kong, to British trade. British traders who lived there didn't have to follow Chinese laws, but had their own laws in a system called extraterritoriality. Side note: extraterritoriality being exempt or free from local laws. I'll continue reading. The Chinese were also forced to limit taxes on imported British goods and had to hand over the territory of Hong Kong to the British. This was a lot of punishment for trying to protect their people, and the opium trade continued. Other Europeans traded with the Chinese. The Chinese offered the Americans the same trading deal they had with the British. Soon after, China's ports were teeming with traders, each setting up their own spheres of influence. Areas where imperial powers had the exclusive trading rights or exclusive mining and railroad building privileges. The Chinese granted other nations these privileges in exchange for money. Britain, the US, France, Germany, Russia, and Japan took advantage of the deal. Because of these new policies, the ruling Qing dynasty, and that's spelled Q-I-N-G, dynasty, was seen as weak and ineffective. In 1850, a group of rebels started the Taiping Rebellion. That's spelled Taiping, rebellion, calling for social reforms like giving land to peasants and treating women as equals of men. The rebels seized Nanjing, killing thousands of people and continuing their massacres for years. Foreign nations took advantage of the unrest to expand their presence in China. Eventually, the Europeans offered to help the Qing dynasty to get things back in order. In 1864, Chinese forces recaptured Nanjing and ended the rebellion. Check on learning answers. 1. Imperialism is the act of extending rule over a foreign country or territory and or holding colonies. 2. European nations could dominate a resource market if one country claimed land for a certain resource. Then it could make all the profit from selling that resource. As that nation became more powerful in the market, other countries would have less and less ability to enter that market. 3. Opium War began because England continued to ship opium to China, even though China asked them to stop. In 1839, the Chinese dumped about 20,000 chests of opium into the sea in protest, and thus began the Opium War. 4. In the Treaty of Nanjing, China was held responsible for the cost of opium and was forced to open 5 coastal ports to British trade. Also, Chinese had to limit taxes on imported British goods, exempt the British traders from local laws, and give Hong Kong to the British. 5. Ignore Chinese law and establish their own set of laws. 6. Nanjing. 7. The East India Company was a British company created in 1600 that held a monopoly on trade with India.